Hello, everyone. Dr. Ames here. This time, our topic is organizational design, effectiveness, and innovation. Here's the learning objectives. You should be able to do this or know these things by the time you're done engaging with this material. You should be able to understand the organizational basics, closed versus open systems, um, put into practice the organizational design concepts that we explore here. Describe and understand the metaphors, mechanistic and organic organizations, be able to assess an organization's effectiveness, and be able, hopefully, to encourage and sustain innovation where it's appropriate in the right context, including invention and creativity and integration. Let's just start with some basics here. A very basic definition of what an organization is. Um, a system of consciously coordinated activities or forces of two or more persons. And that's the one real characteristic of organizations. It is consciously coordinated. And this includes so many things. For instance, those things that we consciously coordinate together. We have common goals. We coordinate our efforts. We divide up our labor. And we have a hierarchy of authority to manage it and to make it all work. So this brings us to just a few basic definitions, which you probably should already be familiar with from uh, some fundamentals of management knowledge you have. First of all, unity of command. This simply means that you report to one and only one boss, and another manager who might come along, say you're an operating employee. Another manager might come along with equal authority to your boss, and so forth, and for whatever reason cannot simply start telling you what to do. And that doesn't mean that someone from another department can't be assigned to be in charge and so forth, but basically unity of command is meant to reduce any ambiguity in the workplace about who reports to who and who can give orders to whom and so forth. And it simply prevents anarchy and chaos. So it's a very useful concept, and indeed that's what we rely on. As well, we use organizational charts. These are simply boxes with lines connecting them to show descending relationships and so forth, what is connected to what in terms of departments and so forth. And there are very clear lines that you can follow, and it helps you make sense of an organization. It's very similar with hierarchy of authority. You can represent it in a chart, and it will be basically a series of relationships connected together, and you'll be able to clearly trace who reports to who and what the job titles are. I've got an example I'll show you of hierarchy of authority here in a moment, and it's really the same type of thing we would see for an organizational chart. Now, division of labor is how we divide up things into different functional areas, and that would be the most basic division of labor. In fact, what are the various functional departments? Do we have an accounting department, an HR department, a manufacturing or operations department, a research and development department if it's the right context, and so forth? Do we have a home office or administration department? That's what we do with division of labor. We divide up the work into meaningful areas, and then we go steps further and we decide what jobs ought to be in those departments, and we indeed do job analysis and job creation, which really is derived out of division of labor. Um, and one thing to note, as you get lower into the hierarchy of any organization, closer down to where actual work is being done at these lower levels, we find that the knowledge and skills needed by the operating employees or the managers, it depends on the type of industry, are becoming much more specific, much more specialized. And then span of control. Now, span of control simply refers to the number of people who report directly to any given manager. And there are many different conditions which affect span of control. Some of them are within the control of a manager and some aren't. but that's really just a number. And it really is how many people do report to any given person. And we can have over control or be overbooked with span of control. And certainly it makes it very tough on managers, and it represents a little bit of a problem within an organization if that does happen. And then we have the notion here of line and staff positions, and this is really about authority. Um, Authority is either line or its staff. Line has formal, legitimate authority to tell people what to do, um, dependent on the job. So first line managers tell their operating employees what to do because they have formal and legitimate authority. And because of unity of command, they are their one and only one boss. They do not report to the boss that their boss reports to. They report directly to that person, and he indeed controls that flow of information and reports to the boss above. Uh, and so that's the way it works. That's a line position. Staff positions can be managers that may not have any particular employees reporting to them, but they still have managerial status. So they may have some specialized knowledge. They may be inventors or creators, or they may be product champions, experts of different types, and they provide information, advice, and research, and generally don't direct any employees. They become staff. And so there is a difference. The staff manager who is a managerial level, say the same as a operating manager, simply can't go and start telling line employees what to do. Now they do have advisory authority. If they were to see something out of line or dangerous, they would want to report it to that manager immediately, and so forth. But generally you follow the chain of command with these sorts of things. But it's line managers who really have the authority to make decisions in an organization. Here's an example of a hierarchy chart, and it shows who reports to who. The chairman is at the top, and then the general manager reports to the chairman, and this, of course, would mean the chairman of the board. And at equal level, it says here, we have a chief finance officer and we have a design studio, the head of that, and so forth. So this is an interesting sort of mix here. This is a combination of both hierarchical chart, talking about departments, but also talking about the different positions within it. So you can really use a chart like this for both things. If you included the names and specific titles here, we would have a much more hierarchical authority chart. The way it looks here, it seems to be leaning a bit more towards organizational type of chart. Let's talk about the concept of closed versus open systems for a moment. Now, of course, you probably already know that a closed system is mostly theoretical. Closed systems do not interact with the environment, and that is basically what an open system is. It's a system of interrelated parts, subsystems, that do interact with the environment. And since closed systems do not and are theoretical, they can't be self-sufficient entities or anything like that. We simply don't have that in our three spheres of human activity, the private sector and the public sector and the nonprofit sector. Closed systems simply can't exist because if nothing comes in and nothing goes out, you aren't really accomplishing anything, excuse me. Now, so the open system is really what we use to say, this is how we are going to understand our organizations. And it is the basic metaphor, and it really does work. I think originally, closer towards the turn of the 20th century, we had a lot of management thinking that there could exist some closed systems. If you had a certain type of very rigorous control and planning, that you could actually have a closed system that could exist outside of society and interacting. And of course, it's not the case, and we do not have closed systems. Factors in the general environment are simply beyond an organization's ability to control in most instances. So an open system relies on constant interaction with the environment. In reality, even open systems are partly closed because think about it, there will be sources of information, certain departments that are not open to external access, say from the outside, and only authorized individuals within an organization, within the subsystems, have access. So we do have this concept that open systems have checks and balances, and where they can close off parts of their own system. And this makes sense that an organization might want to restrict portions of its activities and keep them strictly internal. We have the notion of proprietary information, trademarks, planning and strategic thinking, documents and things. We also have sensitive financial predictions and data, strategic concerns of all types. So that's why organizations are going to be closed in some areas and cut off some of that access. But in general, we would say an open system has permeable boundaries. Things do come in and things do go out. And the things that are going these two directions include people, information, capital, goods and services, of course, because those move back and forth from the environment and out of uh, the organization into the environment again in a value-added system of some type. Um, in an open system, everything is interrelated. And so we often see and hear that an open system is discussed in terms that um, give it living thing attributes, because these open systems are capable of self-correction, and they can adapt, and they indeed have growth depending on how you measure it and so forth. So it does seem at a certain point that an open system can very much uh, act and behave like a living thing, although we know that it is not. But that's when we start looking at various types of open systems and referring to them in many times as organic systems. Now, we also have a type of open system, uh, a learning organization. And it's just really an extension of this open systems concept. We are attributing a certain number or amount of types of living functions to the organization in effort to better understand how that organization really does interact with the environment. So, metaphorically speaking, organizations have cognitive functions like a brain that can perceive information and interpret it. And the organization can solve problems, and it can store and retrieve information, and the organization can learn from experience. So we do have this idea of learning organizations, and we have talked about this in the past. Peter Senge is the professor who coined this term, and I believe that was back in the 70s, but you could correct me on that. Um, and one of the basic tenets of any learning organization is that if we fail at something, that it is not all doom and gloom, that it is really an opportunity for us to learn and move forward. But what often happens with people and with organizations is that we don't always use our failures as a springboard to learn and consequently change our behavior. This is where learning organizations differ. They do learn and change and grow, and we do see different types of learning organizations out there. Certainly, different types of scientific communities are learning organizations. Some educational institutions can be called learning organizations, although at the same time, uh, when we look at educational institutions, they're a form of learning organization, but they're also very mechanized, not very organic. But that's a different discussion. Let's look at this notion of the open system a little more in terms of subsystems. And we can name these any way we want. We could go into an organization and say this department, the operations department, really is the subsystem that makes everything. So this is our operational subsystem. And we could have a home office called administration or just the home office, and we could say this is our administrative subsystem. And we could look at our operating employees from a certain perspective and label them as support personnel subsystem and so forth. So there are many ways to use the concept to understand organizations depending on what you're trying to understand. Now here we have something a little different. We have subsystems made up of some of the tasks and accomplishments and things and characteristics of organizations. So organizations have goals and values. That is one subsystem that interacts with all the other subsystems within the organization. The technical subsystems, the various software packages, the interrelatedness of them, the ease of use, all those sorts of things are also another subsystem. The structural subsystem, and when you see the word structural, of course, you think of design. So we have our organizational design. How are we set up? How well do our departments work together? Do we use a good liaison sort of procedure? How do we do it? And then the psychological subsystem, which tends to speak to our culture and what we share together and norms and values. And it's appropriate that the managerial subsystem in this particular example is right here in the center, because the managerial subsystem ought to be paying attention. Each of the different managers of this subsystem working in their various areas, coordinating, managing, getting the work of the organization done. And how do you do that? Well, it's an open system. Things come in. These are the very four things that we talk about in fundamentals of management. We just give them different labels: material or physical goods, physical resources come in the door, capital or financial resources come in the door, human resources, and informational resources come in. And they run through our subsystems, and we modify and transform into value-added products and services, and out comes a product or a service. And in the case of a nonprofit organization, you're going to have, hopefully, you're looking probably to create some human satisfaction, although you also want that as an output of all your efforts working together. Organizational survival and growth is certainly a goal that you're always going to pursue, no matter which of the three sectors you're in. And then, of course, any social benefits that you provide are also something that comes out exterior that you provide as an organization. You're getting feedback completely in both directions along the way. Now, organizational design, we should equate this with the word structure or structural. That's what we're talking about. The brief definition is design is a structure of accountability and responsibility that an organization uses to execute its strategy. Okay, so a structure of accountability and responsibility. These are the areas that will control different parts of the operation of the organization. The accountability part and the responsibility part. Okay, we're going to make stuff, operations. We're going to control things, the home office. And we may need a human resource management office here, over here in the responsibility, or depending on how you interpret it, maybe our quality control, our shipping and receiving, and so forth. All of these things come out of the notion that we have to accomplish these sorts of things working together. We do this by designing. And we have what we call traditional designs, which would be things like the functional, divisional, and matrix designs. And then we have what are more contemporary designs, referred to as hollow, modular, and virtual, and so forth. Well, let's just briefly identify these. Traditional designs, functional designs, are just traditional business departments: the human resource department, the accounting department, the marketing department. These are all functional, filled with functional level experts and workers who are trained in those areas. Divisional is the product departmentalization that you've decided on. So your departmental choice will be divisional of some type. If you are making something and say you make men's products and women's, you could have divisions. And so a good way to explain that would be a men's division and a women's division. You could have smaller departments within each and so forth. And you could have it more related to product when you do divisional. Of course, matrix, using teams, cross-reporting relationships, always changing your job duties as you work at a place. You get exposed to different skills and abilities, you work on projects, and that's what the matrix does. A very complex and dynamic environment, particularly compared to these other two here, which are traditional ways of organizing ourselves. And then we have these more recent, in recent decades, designs, the horizontal ones. The hollow one is a trend towards outsource everything, that you're a team of just a few individuals. And most everything that needs to be done is outsourced. So your payroll and your accounting is all outsourced. If you make something, you don't really make it. You hire another company to do it for you. You hire a company to transport it and package it and all of those things. That would be a hollow structure. And sometimes this is chosen by some companies that they're faced with extremely strong price competition. So it's a tough business. They have to save money wherever they can. They decide that the way they can do that is to only do what they have to do themselves as a small core group of employees. Um, and you also have to be certain that the companies that you need to do the outsourcing and everything are available and you can afford their services. Modular is very similar to hollow. I find it difficult sometimes to come up with real differences between the two myself, but it is still about outsourcing, but it is more concentrating on you outsource individual product units, but not necessarily the processes themselves. So you are still making something yourself, but maybe not the 100% of the product as it comes out. You may be buying an assembled component that goes into the product. And so the level and or amount of this that you do would say, are you heavily modular or just a little bit modular? But it's very similar to hollow, where it relies on outsourcing. And then, of course, we have virtual companies designed that way, based on use of technology, certainly. They tend to be hollow as well, because it just does make some sense, doesn't it? That if they're going to be virtual and meet only online, you don't need an office. If you don't need an office, you're probably not going to have a lot of people. And you're going to conduct your operations through cyberspace, and you're going to partner with companies that have a lot of expertise and so forth. And the idea here for virtual companies is to be somewhat hollow, but also to use your strategic alliances and form various partnerships that are appropriate for your business. Now, a couple other metaphors here that we should be aware of when it comes to organizations is mechanistic versus organic. Um, and this came to us from Dr. Burns and Dr. Stocker in an article really that's become the a staple of all MBA programs in some class, generally the organizational behavior or organizational theory class at the MBA level. You'll read their basic interpretation of mechanistic versus organic organizations. And what it is, it's about a set of characteristics that organizations might display that say they are more mechanistic or they are more organic. Now, they are certainly still open systems. Now, today, we do use the contingency approach for most everything we do in organizations in general, in our managerial style, in our strategic planning that we do, in our labor projections. All of those sorts of things are based on contingency. Simply about finding the most efficient and effective ways to get things done, to have a good environmental fit in our industry and so forth. We use a contingency approach. When we talk about mechanistic versus organic organizations, we're really talking about organizational behavior and how we observe what an organization actually does, and we can place that on a continuum. So some characteristics are on one end of a continuum of behavior, and some characteristics or attributes of organizations are towards the other end of the continuum. And we would label either end mechanistic, organic. The truth of it is, most organizations are not completely one or the other. And in fact, an organization that might be considered organic might have a very mechanistic operations department. But if you don't have that, you might have a very mechanistic administration where there are very strict protocols and policies and procedures that are followed. but the rest of the company might be very innovative, and so it therefore, for a lot of reasons, might be very organic. So you could have a mix. They're not always, organizations are not always completely one or the other. Although you can look at certain industries and certain operations and say that is mechanistic. If you go to a manufacturer who makes something out of plastic, you're going to go in and see a bunch of machines, probably some consoles, worked by either individual operators, or you may have a supervisor working the console, depending on the complexity of the organization. The certain things like that have to be controlled by rules and regulations for safety, for accuracy, and so forth, for getting the job done. It has to be very mechanistic by nature. So the first thing to understand about this discussion is that one is not necessarily superior or better than the other. They are simply uh, ways that we do things, ways that we approach doing things that are more appropriate in some circumstances than another. So mechanistic organizations are often in manufacturing and in industries like fast food, where everything has to be very efficient, the job's divided up very specifically, where there's heavy reliance on the manager to control and direct things, but employees don't necessarily collaborate and work together that much. They each have their own responsibilities. So that is one thing about a mechanistic organization to say first, that they are generally much more rigid than other organizations. They use bureaucratic principles of control. There are hierarchies of control to go through to ask information queries, to get a request answered, um, to get approval. Very bureaucratic. That means strict rules, narrowly defined jobs and job duties, top-down management, and decision-making controlled very much by management and not much reach out, usually because of the environment as well as managerial style in these particular companies and industries. Um, that relies on managers doing all the thinking and being in charge, employees doing their job, their highly specialized jobs. And then the organic organizations that operate much more like flexible networks of talented individuals doing a variety of tasks who might be challenged to help out, to do something they're not used to doing, to think out of the box, to do more than the average employee, because organic organizations often end up much flatter with fewer managers, so they have fewer departments, fewer employees overall, all doing more work. So there is more emphasis here on decentralization, on autonomy, collaboration, teamwork, and so forth. Now, the various decision-making approaches, whether you are mechanistic or organic, are going to be either decentralized or centralized, or it's going to be some mix of the two. Um, Centralized decision-making means that top managers make all key decisions. There isn't much delegation or empowerment. There are tight rules, controls, and regulations. Decentralized decision-making means many important decisions are made by middle managers and the first line managers, and the more adaptive and organic the organization, even indeed certain employees will be given some responsibility to make low-level decisions. So decentralization, it fosters an environment that is much more adaptive to changing conditions than centralized control. Both centralized and decentralized decision making are on also a continuum of behavior. And organizations, I think, really are constantly striving to find that balance of what works for them. Certainly in your administrative offices and so forth, you have to follow policy and the rules, and you're gathering data and information, and you're assessing employees, and you're assessing how well the company is doing and all of that. There has to be a certain amount of regulation there and so forth. It has to be somewhat mechanistic. That doesn't mean that people can't work together in a spirit of teamwork in a more organic sense. So we have learned in recent decades to be more collaborative, even in mechanistic environments, and find ways to work together rather than rely on our authority to get things done. So But let's keep in mind that we should not view mechanistic or organic as being one or the other particularly superior to the other. They are situationally appropriate. And that brings us to where we started with talking about the contingency approach. Um, think of the chaos and disintegration and disorganization we would be encountering if employees could make food the way they wanted in the steps they wanted in McDonald's, for instance. Certainly, they wouldn't have the efficiency and the timeliness they have, although we might get some interesting new products, right? Here is a comparison of some characteristics of mechanistic and organic organizations that I think are pretty much in line with what I've been telling you. Um, what you need to do and what you need to know to do on your job in a mechanistic organization, that is going to be narrow. It's going to generally be very technical, and that's all that you do. In an organic organization, you may need to have more broad or general knowledge. Um, the link between what you give to the information and what their goals and purpose are, well, in a mechanistic organization, it's sometimes vague or indirect. If you operate a machine, you can certainly see that you're creating products that contribute to the organization's success. But on the other hand, you're not getting much intrinsic value from that and so forth. Where in organic organizations, often it's very clear that what you're getting back from how hard you're working, and there are other things that you're gaining through teamwork and social contact that you're not getting necessarily over here. The flexibility of the work you do, very rigid here, routine, predictable, the same all the time. Over here, unpredictable, flexible, varied. How much uh, technique, obligation, and rights? Is it going to be all spelled out, or are we going to have a broad, looser atmosphere? Well, mechanistic organizations, the rules are spelled out. They are bureaucratic. There's a rule for everything, and a permit needed to get a rule. Over here, organic organizations, you have a broader interpretation. You indeed create the culture together that says this is how we work and this is not how we work. The degree of formal authority exercised, very high in mechanistic organizations, and again, bureaucratic. Now, several times I've referred to bureaucratic in the context of mechanistic organizations, and I've done that on purpose. You can almost equate those. So if someone says bureaucratic, you should think, oh, it's got all these mechanistic characteristics, and here we are talking about them. So the degree of control very high and mechanistic, and it's very low. Here it's compliance. Here it's self-controlled behavior in the organic side. The communication patterns, of course, top down. Over here, horizontal, people talk. Managers talk to workers who are not necessarily peers, but in teams and in organic organizations, they often feel like it. The decision-making style here on the continuum of managerial behavior, it's much more authoritarian. Over here, it's much more, well, indeed, democratic, I would say, consultative, where you ask people questions who should be experts because they're doing the work, they have the knowledge, and participative. You give up some of your work and you indeed enrich their job by giving them low-level authority. Organic, mechanistic. Emphasis on obedience and loyalty, very high. It's all about, like I said here, making you comply. If you follow the rules in a mechanistic organization or bureaucratic organization, you're going to do just fine. If over here, this is not the emphasis. It's the goal. It's getting the work done, and it's hopefully enjoying life and your workday along the way. Now, we need to assess how well we do. That's what organizational effectiveness, when we say we're going to assess it, is all about. So there are ways to do it. And we always want to not rely on opinion and what we think might have happened, but we really want to focus on things that are measurable and that we indeed have data for, and that we have been collecting data through our controlling process as managers and so forth. So some of the generic things that we're going to use, the criteria, did we reach our goals or not? These generic criteria are simply a way to assess how effective we are. And we could use this regardless of the size of our organization or whether we're profit or nonprofit. So this cuts across sectors as well. And there's a lot of overlap here. So they're not necessarily these different things that we do mutually exclusive. In fact, organizations do all of these things. So the goal accomplishment, the most widely used criteria to assess were we effective or not. Effective meaning that we reached our goal, we accomplished our mission. So how well did we do? What degree? And we'll measure it in all sorts of ways, right? We can measure it financially. We can measure it through customer service and satisfaction, stakeholder satisfaction, all sorts of ways we could do that. Uh, so goal accomplishment is big. Your effectiveness measured by how well you meet your goals. And we do tend to set goals for innovation and for speed. And these are very important in some industries and for some companies. Some companies want to gain a widely uh, held reputation for goal attainment because it matters to consumers. So if a company can win awards for quality or safety and so forth, that translates into consumer interest. And so how can you do that? You can do it by accomplishing your goals and being the best and putting out the best products that do happen to win the industry awards or service and so forth. Now, when it comes to resource acquisition, here we're focusing on inputs rather than outputs. We're acquiring resources. So the focus is on factors of production, like the raw materials that we need, the labor we need, the capital, and of course, the managerial expertise that we need. We have to get all of those things, they come in the door. And if we're smart, we get the very best of each and the best deal we can get along the way. Um, Nonprofit organizations do these same things. The Salvation Army, for instance, one measure of their effectiveness is how much money can they raise per kettle around the country during specific holiday seasons and so forth. And then we have other criteria we can invent ourselves, invent these things that match up to what we do in our particular business context or our nonprofit context. These internal processes can be divided into four categories: innovation, customer service and satisfaction, operation excellence, and corporate citizen. How well are we at being a good corporate citizen? Now, those things are important and they cover a lot of territory. And so, this is a way that you can measure yourself in each of those particular areas. And the more areas that you assess yourself in as an organization, the better. You get a much more holistic, say, a much more well rounded perspective of your operations and where you are doing well and maybe where you're not doing so well and where you can improve and so forth. Certainly, you want to assess your effectiveness and are you satisfying the parties that matter? And so that means your strategic constituencies, your stakeholders. And stakeholders, of course, are anyone that has an interest in you succeeding. And so it's going to be your employees and their families and your suppliers and the companies you have alliances with and your customers and all of those things. So you hold a stakeholder audit. And the first thing that will do is identify who all your stakeholders are in case that you haven't realized that certain parties or groups and populations really are your stakeholders. And you do have to do somewhat of a balancing act depending on how many stakeholder constituencies you really do have. Um, when you do a stakeholder audit, you're going to hopefully discover some warning signs, if they're there, of ineffectiveness. In other words, you do want to assess all the time and see how you're doing, because if you don't know where you're falling short, where you're not doing well, then how do you correct it? So you have to be able to see what are the warning signs. And here are 14 of them. I'm just going to briefly mention them at best. But I think all of these you can see are various things that could happen to any organization depending more or less on the organization and the industry it's in and so forth. For instance, you've got too many people, or your organizational culture is um, you tolerate incompetence. When people do really badly and have poor performance over time, You don't move them along or give them training or move them out of the organization. You tolerate incompetence or even reward it. Too many rules and regulations. Often that makes it very tough. It makes you much more mechanistic and much more bureaucratic with cumbersome processes for everything. Too much staff power. That means too many people without people reporting to them, standing around, knowing really there for their expertise and their advice. And you really ought to be taking a look at, is this an effective thing that we're doing? Do we have the right people in the right areas, and do we have the right number of them? So you don't want way too many. It's overhead cost. Replacing substance with form. In other words, we talk a good game, but we don't come through. Scarcity of good goals and decision benchmarks. Well, that's all again about planning and decision making, and that ought to be an ongoing process where you never really rewrite the 5-year plan unless you're identified through your various audits that you're in trouble. Otherwise, it ought to be an ongoing revision and modification as you proceed. Fear of embarrassment and conflict. If people are afraid to bring something to light or afraid to approach certain managers, you do have an organizational problem and something will have to be done. You will notice things happening like people aren't communicating, that you'll start to question the way that the processes and procedures are set up. Do we have poor coordination, or do we have good liaison sort of procedures and processes set in place? Do we hear our leaders scapegoating each other either in person or in the hallways? Um, do we find that there has been a lot of change and that many people have resisted it and their concerns haven't been met, perhaps, or something like that? But it's an atmosphere where people are constantly fearing the unknown, possibly. This does lead to low morale. It does lead to more vocal special interest groups, because special interest groups, when they're active, really it's politicking. And they become much more vocal when things aren't going well, and simply they become much more vocal when not enough information is being disseminated within the company. And then, of course, when all of a sudden you have all these things in place and you're not getting any new ideas and people don't really seem to be contributing and so forth. These and many others are things that would tell you, that would come out in a variety of different types of assessments, that maybe things aren't going well and we have some issues. Now, finally, let's wrap it up with a very quick and brief discussion of organizational innovation. There are some myths here about innovation. That, one, it has to have a eureka moment. That this is a myth. It really is. This doesn't involve suddenly someone getting a hit by a bolt of lightning or their brain popping and smoke coming out of their ears, and they have a eureka moment. They figured out the secret of the universe. This is a myth that innovation or creativity happens in this way. It doesn't. Most of the time, it's the work of ongoing and long-lasting hard work and planning. It can be very time-consuming. And people's subconscious minds are working on something for a very long time. Just because they finally achieve a breakthrough, an epiphany, so to speak, or an understanding of something, doesn't mean that it suddenly exploded out of nowhere like a eureka moment. It's the product of all the effort and hard work a person or an individual or a group of individuals have put together over time. So that's the first thing to say, that there is no eureka moment, really. It's a really incorrect way to look at it. Organization innovation really requires an investment of time and resources. Another myth is that you can systematize your innovation. You can find a process and pigeonhole people into a certain arrangement or hierarchy that will lead to the best innovation. Nope, it simply doesn't work that way with people. And that's not how creativity works. You can't systematize it. You can create tools for people to use and make it easier for them to expand on their own creativity. But it's not going to be a system that creates it, innovation or creativity. You simply can't do that. There are too many challenges with innovation to make it a standardized process, in other words. So organizational innovation really does have some characteristics. It takes hard work, in a specific direction, usually over some time. Sometimes it takes changing your approach, and maybe changing your approach more than once. Often, one of the characteristics of innovation is that it's a response to someone's curiosity and their experimentation. Uh, and this requires a certain amount of organizational commitment and support. Sometimes it's an effort to make more money, other times it's an effort at survival. Sometimes it gets done out of necessity in order to accomplish some larger goal. And often innovation is the result of interaction of many of these factors. And a great example of this is the Post-it note. One technician sitting at his desk one day at 3 a.m. was always taping little bits of paper and notes to his console. And one day he thought he would put some uh, self-removing adhesive on the back of a little piece of paper and stick it on his screen. And he did it, and he had an epiphany, not a eureka moment, that, this is so useful that maybe others would find it useful too. And the company, of course, that's one of their famous products today. So sometimes innovations just happen, but it happened in him a process of using information over a long time. It was a process of using and developing his information and making sense of it. And during that process, he came up with a way to make the process easier and so forth. And so sometimes innovation comes unexpectedly, and that's another reason we can't standardize it, out of the most unexpected directions. It is a challenge to reach the consumer or potential consumers. And that is one of the challenges that we have to do. Sometimes we can innovate and create something new, and we're just not really sure if people really want it or think that they will need it. So we do have to help consumers a little bit in this process. It's a challenge that you do have to specifically state how this product will help someone in some way or solve some need. So at the end of the day, that innovation has to have a purpose that solves a want or a need. So innovation in that sense lines up perfectly with the way we think in marketing and so forth. Um, And if that's the case, we want to solve a way, a want or a need. We're really thinking already about segmenting our market and so forth. So you can see that organizational innovation is a piece of the bigger thing that we do in commerce and human interaction. And in the business sense, if you want to beat the competition, you must focus on a few innovations and not get spread out too much in projects, unless you are a very large company that can indeed maybe use a matrix sort of organization to get things like that done. But generally, we rely on more mundane things like timing. Timing is important in releasing innovation, new products, new services, the time of the year, or the timely response to a certain situation, and so forth. Um, and we've seen this as a great example, the development of these new vaccines in response to a certain situation. And they did it in a new way. For the first time, we're getting a vaccination that doesn't comprise of dead cells or living cells of the very thing that we're worried about catching. It's a genetic thing that we're being injected with that will fool our bodies into creating the proper antibodies that we need. But it doesn't inject us with any COVID-19 at all. So that was a challenge that the pharmaceutical industry actually rose to and came up with the right solution. And then finally, the challenge of remaining profitable while you spend all these time and resources on innovation. You've got to have core operations, of course, that keep you profitable and keep you above water while you're trying to expand the things that you do. So you have to remain profitable while you pursue innovation. Okay, folks, that wraps it up for this time. I'll talk to you again soon.